In the early 1700s, a man would meet a horrible fate out in the Pacific Ocean. It was by his own request that Alexander Selkirk would be dropped off on a remote tropical island off the coast of Chile with nothing but a knife, hatchet, musket, cooking pot, and his wits to survive. This is the story of the real-life castaway. Alexander Selkirk was born in Scotland in 1676. His father was a shoemaker in Lower Largo, a small village on the eastern side of Scotland. From a very young age, it was apparent that Alexander was a troublemaker. According to those close to him, he had a, quote, unruly disposition. By age 16, Alexander had been called to talk to the village elders due to indecent conduct at the local church. But to the surprise of everyone there, Alexander never showed up for his appointed date. Instead, Alexander had taken off to the ocean as a member of a ship crew, and so his long career as a sailor had begun. Eventually this shifted into buccaneering as Alexander joined a privateer named William Dampier. For those who aren't aware, buccaneers were a type of free sailor that operated mainly in the Caribbean during the 17th century. They weren't all pirates, but many of them were known for attacking Spanish vessels as well as Spanish ports. Alexander made well for himself during this time, and for about a year he operated as a loyal crewmate. Dampier's crew managed to land several notable jobs during this time, which involved the crew attacking any foreign vessels in English waters. After this, Alexander was promoted to sailing master on the companion ship called Cinque Ports. Dampier's crew was now composed of a main ship as well as a companion ship that Alexander helped operate, making their group a force to be reckoned with. But as soon as things began to build for the ambitious crew, they quickly fell apart. Not long after this, Dampier's crew suffered a devastating loss after an attempted raid at a gold mining town in Panama. To the crew's total shock, they were ambushed upon arrival, and while a majority of them managed to escape with their lives, the damage had been done. For the next year, several key members of the crew would leave, and the aspirations for the crew continued to dwindle. Remember when I mentioned that Alexander was known for his unruly disposition? Well, that didn't just go away when he became a sailor. In the year of 1704, when Alexander was just 28 years old, Dampier's crew stopped on a remote island off the coast of Chile named Masa Tierra, now known as Robinson Crusoe Island. During their time here, Alexander got into an argument with Dampier about the conditions of their ship. Alexander claimed that it was far too dangerous to continue without proper repairs, and stated that he'd rather stay on this island than step foot back on that vessel. Dampier didn't take too kindly to this argument, and decided that he would take Alexander up on this offer. So, Alexander was left alone on an island 418 miles or 705 kilometers off the coast of Chile. According to sources, the brash Alexander attempted to convince Dampier to let him back on board, realizing the scope of the situation he was about to be in. But Dampier denied his request. Just like that, Alexander was alone. But he wasn't going to sit down and accept his fate. He decided he'd attempt to survive the situation. The beginning of his stay was a rather difficult one, as most would imagine. According to sources, he survived off of spiny lobsters during the start of his stay. Every day, Alexander would scan the ocean floor for anything he could consume, desperate to fill his belly and adjust to the new conditions. This wasn't the only problem for Alexander, as he also had to deal with intense feelings of loneliness, as everyone would imagine. He was the only person on this island, and it was highly unlikely that anyone would be coming his way anytime soon. Alexander tried his best to stay positive and fight against these emotions, but soon a new enemy emerged that would put an end to Alexander's beachside home. This foe might be a surprising one to some, and that was sea lions. You see, Alexander managed to find shelter within a cave on the coast, but the sea lions soon became a huge issue for him. He had been relying on shellfish for a majority of his food, but the mass amount of sea lions made it nearly impossible to find any sustainable food. Not to mention, the thought of leaving and going deeper into the island was terrifying, as Alexander continued to hear strange sounds coming from inside the island, which scared him. Alexander debated his situation for days, but when he realized that he really had no choice but to move into the island, he decided to face his fears head on and move. Luckily for Alexander, this turned out to be a great decision, as the area behind the beach was a lush valley littered with cabbage palms. For those who are unaware, cabbage palms provide a source of edible leaf buds that have been described as tasting like cabbage, and also grows an abundant amount of berries that have a sweet flavor. But this wasn't the end of the valley's benefits. It turns out that a prior expedition had also released goats onto the island, and at this point they were feral and free roaming all around the area. Luckily for Alexander, he had been left with a musket, so hunting these creatures was quite easy for a while. For the first time in weeks, Alexander was sleeping with a full belly. On top of this, Alexander eventually had to improvise his tactics to hunt the wild goats, as he soon ran out of gunpowder for his musket. So he soon taught himself how to ambush the creatures and chase them down with a spear. Reports even confirmed that he was eventually able to domesticate a few of these wild goats, and even use them for milk. This wasn't the only animal he domesticated on the island. According to Alexander, he also befriended some of the wild cat population. These cats would sleep alongside Alexander at night and protect him from the wild rats on the island that would reportedly nip at him while he slept. At this point, Alexander had amassed quite the camp as time went on. He reportedly had built several small huts by a river in the valley, and while he was still lonely, he found solace and comfort while reading his Bible. Religion became the backbone of his strength on the island, but he still kept hope that someone would rescue him. Occasionally, he would set fires on the island's coast in hopes that nearby ships would notice, but he had no such luck. Several months had passed for Alexander, and while he was doing quite well given the circumstances, he realized that tough times were on the horizon with winter coming. Thanks to Alexander's time spent as a buccaneer, he knew with winter came lots of rain in this area, and while his huts down in the valley were nice, they would prove to be disastrous during the winter months with heavy rainfall. So not wasting any time, Alexander made his way to higher ground. He managed to find a spot protected by the shade of some trees. Utilizing some of the tools he was stranded with, Alexander built 2 more huts from the wood of pimento trees. He thatched the roof from nearby highland grass. Alexander even managed to build some furniture for the inside of his huts. He now had a bed to sleep on, and while it wasn't very comfortable, once he began to line the bed with goatskin sheets, he was starting to feel like home. Just as Alexander had prepared for, winter soon came, and with it, he began to line the walls of his hut with goatskins to keep himself warm. Despite the feelings of loneliness in the back of Alexander's head, he continually managed to improve his situation. The island was brimming with lobsters, and with the seals heading out for the winter, Alexander was able to return to the beaches to hunt them. Alexander became so skilled in cooking while he was there, he even managed to flavor the lobsters he caught with wild pepper berries. He also managed to find wild turnips, parsley, watercress, and parsnips. Alexander was not without troubles though. His clothes and equipment were running out, and while gunpowder wasn't a necessity for him anymore, as he had learned to hunt without it, his original knife was now in terrible condition. This obviously worried Alexander, and while Alexander was by no means a lucky individual, he did manage to find a washed-up barrel with iron bracings. Once again, Alexander showed ingenuity as he managed to forge the iron he found into several new knives. He also managed to build goatskin clothes to help him combat the colder weather. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned to years for Alexander. He continued his life on the island, living day by day, reading his Bible, proclaiming verses from the top of his mountain hut, and hoping that one day he would see a boat rest their anchor in the waters of the island. It would be several years until this day would come. On a day like any other, Alexander was going about his routine of survival when suddenly he spotted 2 ships off the coast of the island. A bright smile immediately shot across his face, as without hesitation he dashed down the valley and trampled onto the sandy beach. Alexander immediately began to call down the ships in the harbor to the island, and before long the galleys sent out their own rowboats to the island. Alexander was in a state of euphoria. After years on the island, he was finally going to be saved. But then his heart sank to the bottom of his chest. He froze for a moment as his eyes light upon the flag of the ships he was awaiting. It was the Spanish. With the British and Spanish locked in a war right now, if they knew Alexander had sailed under the English crown, he would be a dead man, or forced into a work camp. A fate that Alexander decided was worse than being stranded on this island. According to Alexander, he took off as the landing party had reached the shore. The Spanish men fired off a shot at him as he dashed into the tree line and went to hide. For the next several hours, the Spanish men scoured the beach and nearby areas searching for him, but eventually they decided it wasn't worth it and took off back to their ship. Alexander had likely dodged a horrible fate had he given in to his temptations to leave the island. Alexander had another brush with death after this. During a routine goat hunt, Alexander had given chase to a rather quick one. While this wasn't unusual for him, he neglected to realize the dangers he was rapidly approaching. In the midst of his chase, the two of them ran directly off a cliff and plummeted an unknown distance to the ground. Alexander landed directly on his back and was immediately knocked unconscious. According to Alexander, he was unconscious for an entire day, and when he awoke, he realized the only reason he had not broke his back was due to the fact that he landed upon the goat. Alexander would continue to live his life on the island for years. While he was arguably surviving better than most would, he was still extremely lonely. Every day he would sit on his mountainside lookout, praying that a ship would come to his rescue. After the run-in with the Spanish crew, Alexander became extremely cautious to any ships that may appear. In the year of 1709, 4 years and 4 months after he had originally been left on the island, Dampier's crew would return to the same location. For those who have forgotten, Dampier was the original ship captain that left Alexander there in the first place. Alexander saw these ships from the lookout and was nearly positive they were British vessels. He immediately took off down the mountain and started a fire on the beach to flag them down. The crew saw this and sent out a party of their own to fetch him. Upon interacting with Alexander, one of them described him as looking like a, quote, hairy ape, but the crew also saw something within Alexander that made them rethink their own lives. According to the captain of the second ship under Dampier's rule, Alexander had developed a peace of mind while on the island, and said that the isolation and removal from society wasn't as bad for Alexander as most would imagine. You would think that a man lost at sea for years would want to return home immediately, but Alexander was a different breed. He was in no rush to return home, and after Dampier promoted him to the first mate of one of the ships called Duke, he continued with his lifestyle. Alexander would spend the next 2 years at sea, undergoing endless adventures and close calls with death. During this time, he became an incredibly rich man, and eventually returned home. To his surprise, he had gained the respect from his family, who had heard of his endeavors. Alexander had become a legend around his hometown, and was far from the rowdy teen he once was. Alexander would marry a few years later, but a quiet life in Scotland just didn't fit him. According to Alexander, he stated that despite his riches, he would never be as happy as he was when he was worth nothing. This deep need for adventure would prove to continue for Alexander, as not long after his marriage, he would rejoin another crew for a journey down to South Africa. Alexander Selkirk would unfortunately pass away from yellow fever a year into his journey, but his legend would remain alive to this very day. I believe Alexander Selkirk's story is an incredibly important one. Themes of redemption, ingenuity, success, and proving yourself are littered throughout his life. Alexander's time spent on the island can serve as a message of possibility for anyone who is going through rough times. His story can prove to us that while the support of others is important, we can and will endure rough times if we keep our head up and believe in our own abilities. Alexander's life is a testament to the willpower and strength the human spirit has within itself. His journey has sparked stories such as Castaway, Robinson Crusoe, and many more. And I believe if we continue to share his story, he will be a source of inspiration for many years to come. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and leaving a like. I can't thank all of you enough for the support lately. Have a great day. Goodbye.